We cannot accept what they've offered, and we will not give what they've asked.
We cannot accept what they offered. We will not give what they asked. Last evening, Mark Carney instructed Canada's entire negotiating team to pack up and return to Ottawa. Not a pause, not a recess, a suspension. The talks are over until America comes back with something fundamentally different. And in the press conference that followed, Carney did something that Washington has not seen from a Canadian Prime Minister in the entire history of this trade dispute. He listed every single justification America has ever given for its tariffs, every shifting excuse, every changing rationale, and let the list itself destroy the credibility of all of them. Then he turned to the trade deficit claim, the one Trump returns to constantly, and delivered a warning so precise and so factual that every American energy executive watching should have felt it. Your generation has seen enough broken negotiations to know what this moment means. This is not drama. This is a line. Subscribe to Canada Point right now because tonight we are breaking down the most significant trade war development Canada has seen yet. Before we hear Carney's full statement, let us be precise about what actually happened in those final hours of negotiation. Canada went into these talks with a clear mandate: preserve tariff-free access for the vast majority of Canadian businesses, provide greater stability to the trade relationship, significantly reduce American tariffs on key strategic industries, especially autos, protect small and medium businesses, and above all maintain Canada's flexibility, independence, and sovereignty. Canada was willing to offer real concessions: remove retaliatory tariffs on steel, aluminum, and autos if America substantially lowered theirs, encourage provinces to return American alcohol to shelves, take administrative measures around supply management, and then in the final hours, Washington changed the terms. Last-minute auto exclusions with no rationale. Ford's Oakville plant building F-350s and F-550s suddenly excluded. GM Silverado excluded. Language inserted that would restrict Canada's ability to sign trade deals with other countries. Attempts to limit Canadian cultural and language protections. Not a negotiating position, a power play. Designed not to reach a deal but to lock Canada into permanent dependency. Carney walked away, and then he explained exactly why.
We've been under no illusions. We recognized from the start that America has changed. Early last year in this room, I observed that the decades-long process of steadily increasing integration between our economies was over. Our government understood before many that America would transform all of its commercial relationships, that it would put a series of tariffs on its closest allies and use economic integration as a weapon. We recognize that sometimes its signature was written in pencil. We worked in that context to try to strike a fair deal on which Canadian businesses and workers could rely. Our goal has always been to get the best deal for Canadians, never a deal at any price or on any time frame. Last month, when the United States announced another round of unjustified tariffs, I gave our negotiating team a new mandate to seek a fair deal negotiated in good faith. Because I believe that people on the ground, on both sides of our border, want this relationship to work. The bonds between Canadians and Americans are long, and they remain strong. A mutually beneficial trade agreement is possible, one that respects our sovereignty, one that builds on our complementary strengths, one that lowers costs for families on both sides of the border, one that creates good jobs for our workers. Canada has always worked towards these goals, even while America's attention and dedication to them have wavered. We've consistently proposed long-term partnerships, while America has often pursued short-term transactions. The gap between partnership and competitor, unfortunately, has remained too wide in recent days. So last evening, I instructed our negotiators to return to Ottawa. We cannot accept what they've offered, and we will not give what they've asked. Over the past year, the U.S. has imposed a series of tariffs that violate its commitment under our agreement with them in Mexico, so-called CUSMA. The United States has continually changed the rationale for these actions, from fentanyl to taxes on U.S. tech giants, to certification of U.S. aircraft, to the sharing of tolls of a bridge that Canada built and paid for, to our dairy policy, to provincial decisions not to sell American alcohol during the trade war, to a television advertisement that quoted Ronald Reagan, to smoke from wildfires while they threatened our communities. Another prominent justification for U.S. tariffs has been their claim that since the United States runs, quote, a trade deficit with Canada, we were ripping them off. Also a quote. But the U.S.'s narrow merchandise trade deficit only exists because the U.S. buys so much of its energy from Canada. Canada fuels American growth, supplying 99% of their natural gas imports, 85% of their electricity imports, 60% of their crude oil imports. I don't think they want us to stop sending any of that energy.
That list. Your generation deserves to sit with that list for a moment, because it is one of the most devastating things any Canadian Prime Minister has ever said publicly about an American administration. Fentanyl, tech taxes, aircraft certification, bridge tolls on a bridge Canada built and paid for, dairy policy, provincial alcohol decisions during a trade war, a television advertisement quoting Ronald Reagan, wildfire smoke threatening Canadian communities. Every single one of those justifications was used by the Trump administration to impose tariffs on Canada. Every single one was a different story for a different news cycle. And putting them all in one sentence exposes what they actually were. Not policy, not principle, not consistent economic reasoning. Noise. Shifting noise designed to keep Canada off balance and under pressure, while the real objective, locking Canada into permanent dependency, was pursued through the negotiations themselves, and then the warning that should have Washington's energy officials paying very close attention tonight. Canada supplies 99% of American natural gas imports, 85% of American electricity imports, 60% of American crude oil imports. Carney looked into the camera and said quietly but unmistakably, "I do not think they want us to stop sending any of that energy." That is not a threat. That is a fact delivered in a tone that makes the implication impossible to miss. When reporters pressed Carney for the specific last-minute changes that made a deal impossible, he gave three answers that every Canadian worker in auto, steel, and manufacturing needs to hear. First, the auto industry terms. Washington wanted to exclude medium and heavy-duty trucks from the agreement. No rationale given, just exclusion, which meant the Ford Oakville plant building F-350s, F-450s, and F-550s would have been left without protection. The GM Silverado same, effectively making Canadian production uneconomic over time while pretending to do a deal. Second, language restricting Canada's ability to sign trade deals with other countries. Canada has completed 20 new economic and security partnerships in the last year, is on track to double market access to 3 billion consumers. The Americans wanted to stop that. Unacceptable was the word Carney used. No qualification around it. Third, efforts to restrict Canadian cultural and language protections. Sovereignty itself, always resisted, always will be. Any one of those individually would have given a weaker government reason to hesitate. All three together in the final hours revealed what Carney called the cumulative effect, proof that Washington was not seeking a genuine economic partnership. It was seeking control.
First, with respect to the auto industry, both in terms of the level of the tariffs, the treatment of Canadian content, so Canadian parts, Canadian steel, Canadian content in vehicles, the scope of the tariffs. The Americans wanted to limit it to autos only, not include medium and heavy autos and light trucks, to be more specific, not include medium and heavy duty trucks, which is a big change. obviously, and with respect to Ford's new plant, for example, in Oakville, which is F-350s, 450s, 550s, they would have been excluded. GM Silverado, same thing, would have been excluded from that. No rationale, just for exclusion. So effectively moving into a series of terms that would made the production more uneconomic over time. Okay, so that's a change. That restriction, that clarification, that precision was a change. The U.S. introduced in the last hours, efforts to restrict our ability to have other trade deals. You heard me say a moment ago what we've accomplished in the last year: 20 new deals, economic and security partnerships. The prospect of doubling our market access because we believe in free trade. We're the partner of choice in many respects for countries around the world, and the Americans wanted to restrict that. They had language that they wanted to restrict that. Unacceptable. And I'll give you a third, et peut-être on peut discuter plus en français. Continual efforts, always resisted, as I said in my remarks, and always will be resisted, efforts to restrict our protections of our language, our culture, and in effect, our sovereignty.
And then Carney did what great leaders do after delivering difficult news. He turned to where Canada goes from here. Canada will match Washington's new tariffs dollar for dollar, concentrated in steel, dairy appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics, a focused response to protect Canadian industries and allow them to compete with American products in the Canadian market. But more importantly, Canada is already building alternatives that make the American market less essential than it was 18 months ago. 27 nation-building initiatives referred to the Major Projects Office, representing $500 billion in new private investment. The largest clean energy project in North American history launched in Labrador, $500 billion in defense investment, 20 new trade and security deals across 5 continents, free trade access to 1.5 billion consumers, expanding to 3 billion by year-end. Jobs growing at 4 times the American rate, foreign investment at a 20-year high, second fastest G7 growth projected this year and next. Carney put it plainly, we are already giving ourselves more than they can take away, and we are just getting started. And Carney closed with something that your generation needs to hear not as poetry but as strategy. Canadians do not submit to the weather, we thrive in it. We do not wait to see which way the wind is blowing, or surrender ourselves to the waves to be storm-tossed by events. We set our own course. We make our own weather. Your generation has lived through recessions, energy crises, constitutional battles, Quebec referendums, trade disputes with America that felt existential at the time and were navigated through patience, discipline, and the refusal to accept that Canada's only option was whatever Washington offered. This moment is not different in kind, it is different in scale. And the response Carney described, building at home, diversifying abroad, matching American tariffs, protecting Canadian workers, supporting businesses for as long as it takes, is the same response that has always worked. Not submission, not panic, not accepting a bad deal because the deadline feels urgent, setting our own course, making our own weather. America tried to break Canada yesterday. It did not work. It did not work because Canada had spent 18 months preparing for exactly this scenario. Building the fiscal reserves, diversifying the trade relationships, completing 20 new partnerships, investing in domestic infrastructure at a scale not seen in decades, creating the conditions where walking away from a bad American deal was a real option, not an empty threat. Carney said something at the end of that press conference that every Canadian over the age of 60 who remembers building this country should hear directly. Last spring, I warned that America is trying to break us so they can own us, and I promised that will never ever happen. We are keeping that promise. The talks are suspended, the team is home, the tariffs are being matched, the investments continue, the trade deals with the rest of the world continue, and the Prime Minister of Canada stood in front of the country yesterday and said clearly, they asked too much and they offered too little, and then walked out of the room. That is not weakness. That is exactly the kind of leadership your generation built this country to produce. Subscribe to Canada Point for honest analysis of the most important economic story in Canadian history. Turn on notifications, and we will see you in the next one.